All right, we got a really important news update about what's happening in Pennsylvania. We have been hearing more and more about more legislation and more push. This is attorney Kathleen Kane, who has been pushing for the statute of limitations on victims, which that would give them the ability to go ahead and sue in a civil lawsuit regarding child sexual abuse. As you know, Pennsylvania has an epidemic across the country as well of child sexual abuse cases that cannot be pursued. And for Brenda Dick, who was a victim, came forward at 21 years old, it has been a life sentence, as she stated in Center Daily. In Pennsylvania, we have some issues that have yet to be addressed about years of sexual abuse. Families traumatized, left in recovery mode, and all they're told is to get over it, move on. For a family, it's a matter of life and death. It's a crisis. It's drug addiction. It's followed with all kinds of problems. Well, there's less and less more burden of proof put on the victims and the family to prove and validate their case. A lot of the questions need to be redirected at the predators, the ones who have actually caused the actual problem to begin with. These children never asked to be victims, by the way. No, most victims never get their story told correctly. Actually, if you really find out more about what's going on in Harrisburg, all you have to do is call your representatives. I want to tell you first and foremost that I know as we get more informed about what's going on in Pennsylvania, all you have to do is look at some of the statistics in PCAR and the rape epidemic and sexual abuse cases that have yet to be pushed forward, mainly because of HR 655. This actual bill needs to be eliminated in order for that extension to go forward for children and families who were victims of sexual abuse to pursue their cases. This actually has to change. HR 951 is to eliminate any statute of limitations. Do you realize what victims are asked to do? They have to prove their case over and over again. And this is just leads to being re-traumatized, reliving it. And the truth be known is that victims don't have to relive this. And actually, you do have representatives in state and county that are pushing for this. Right now, as it stands, according to the representative in Beaver County, Representative Kristana's office, this is just kicked around as window legislation. We know it's election year, and the election is May 16th, 2017. There's a big epidemic that is occurring nationwide and globally, but here in Pennsylvania, we've heard of the cases of Jerry Sandusky, and you've heard of cases. You haven't heard of a lot of the other cases that have gone unnoticed. And unfortunately, to pursue a civil lawsuit right now, to follow up on going back 30 years of sexual abuse cases, some of these victims have yet to be compensated. And I'm going to tell you truthfully, victims' compensation only covers so much. It may cover the gas and mileage to get back and forth to court. And you usually, if you have a caseworker that is working on these cases regarding sexual abuse, neglect, all these things that are going on within these cases, you can actually get to the bottom of what's really going on, and it's HR 951. And for the families that have left silent and they have not really discussed this, they find out that the representatives are taking charge of this issue in Harrisburg as we speak, but because it's election year, it's kind of gone silent. These articles I'm going to put in the description box below for those who want to know more about this issue. You are voting in Pennsylvania. You need to know more about the judges that are running and how do they feel about HR 951? Will they eliminate HR 651? That being said, find out from your judges and your local officials that are running in your district this year. For those of you who heard about the case of what's going on in Washington, D.C., it's called Pizzagate, Pedogate. Well, there's been an epidemic and a crime that's been committed in Pennsylvania that was very much part of the national discussion. The conversation was about Jerry Sandusky, a very well-known person who kind of hid from justice. It was because of who he knew. And a lot of people were taken back by this report. And as we heard the stories of victim one and how he had to try to have a normal life after all this, all the publicity because of who Jerry Sandusky was. Now, if that would have been anyone else, maybe it wouldn't have gotten the publicity that it did. Nonetheless, it put the center on everything on State College. And it was a real hard time for the Pennsylvanians because many of us who are football fans, of course, if you're from Pittsburgh, it's the Steelers. For those who are in Philadelphia, it's the Eagles. Or if you are a college sports fan, of course, you could go on to the list of Penn State, Pitt, Duquesne, and on and into all the Lock Haven and on and on. The thing is that this has been such a serious issue here in Pennsylvania. Our sports programs are so important, and the teachers that run them and the coaches that run them, I can imagine how hard it is to be compromised as a teacher. If you know somebody close to you has been committing a crime, this is probably more difficult because it puts teachers in situations that they normally would not be put in. It puts all kinds of other professionals in positions they're not typically used to, and it compromises everybody. It's happening in police departments. It's happening everywhere. So obviously this issue isn't going away, and now of course, the case is in Altoona, with which the diocese is now responsible for hundreds of children being raped over 40 years. These cases have even yet to really get the proper adjudication, well, I would say proper justice they deserve, because these victims still have yet to receive victims' compensation, which is allowed by law, that if their case is proven in court that they are allowed to have that compensation. But that's where it stops. The money dries up, and I'm going to tell you, our budget problems are part of this because money is not being allocated to these kids, which it should be. There's no reason. You should just eliminate H.R. 951, and a lot of that will open up the window of opportunities. Right now, it's just window legislation. We've wrote letters to our state representatives, and we're asking for more help for our law enforcement to do more programs and support victims of abuse. Instead of asking the victim and putting them on the hot seat and interrogating the victim, it should be opposite. I want to tell you what it's really like to listen to people interrogate a victim, not the perpetrator. It is a tragedy because the focus has not been on the predators. It's not been on that. Actually, you have people thinking the predators are the victims. That's how strange this line of thinking has been. And I think most people are confused about the issue about child predators and sexual abuse victims. And I would go as far as even domestic violence, because all these issues are issues that are going on within our communities and state. Officer Scott Basham and another officer were going on a domestic violence call. This was a repeat call going to the same address. What made this night different is that these guys were ambushed by the abuser. The domestic violence victim was also murdered. We're looking at the crime legislation and the changes that are happening at the state level, and I want to say it's incredible. Representative Becky Coben, who stood in front, and she pushed this legislation forward regarding homicide victims. If you are strangled, you will have your day in court. This is incredible what is happening in Pennsylvania. Cleaning up the problem doesn't just happen at the state level. It starts at the community level. For many of you, you might be going to your polls this May 16, 2017. We need to know what our judges and our community leaders think of H.R. 951. Are they willing to change the way we look at crime and victims? Or are you going to continue to put the victims and interrogate them? Because I'm going to tell you that we need to reverse the rule. I really believe by the way people are enforcing this issue into Harrisburg, into the discussion, we should all be asking this. Why not revive the block parent program from the 1970s, early 80s? You know, it used to be word of mouth and talking to your neighbors. This is how we solved a lot of our problems. You didn't have to wait for the 6 o'clock news. Most of your community engaged, and they said, we're going to crack down on this. We're not going to let that family suffer in silence. That was the way things were done in Pennsylvania. And more, they flip it around and they are accusing victims of these crimes. It's really, really perverted what is happening. The greatest injustices that are happening in our homes, domestic violence being one of them. So when we talked to Representative Becky Corbin, and I made a phone call to Representative, the representative in Washington County, he was not there for comment. He was one of the representatives that went to the House floor last year, and that was, I believe, in November when Officer Basham died. He was actually, I mean, if you really find out more about Officer Basham, he was a really fun-loving man. If you really get to know a lot of these families that have lost loved ones, officers that were ambushed, we have not strangers to the victims of violent crimes. And of course, now our police officers are victims. In fact, if you ask some of the police departments, they hate to go on domestic violence calls, only because there's so many walls that are put up. And a lot of times what ends up happening is you go down to night court and you get an emergency PFA, and most likely the people might be falsely reporting. You don't know the extent, but the judges are awarding emergency PFAs for a lot of things. And we're asking our judges to find out more about what's going on in the crime statistics. And here's the thing. One of the patterns of a continual crime is that you can see that name coming up in the database. That person's been victim over and over again, okay? And you can ask local police departments who've dealt with the same victims over and over again. There's a cry for help. Do not ignore that. Many of our hotlines, they talk to the same people all the time, meaning there is something happening. When victims go ignored, or they have to hear something from the other end, well, our time is up, we can't talk to you anymore. That doesn't mean that victims got the help. Usually they'll be calling you back and over again. You will stop hearing from the victims when you start acknowledging what's going on with the crime victims in Pennsylvania. It's absurd for somebody to say to that victim, just move on. That victim might have had a broken nose. They can't even see. I was that victim. On April 2007, I was punched in the nose. I was bleeding. I had a cracked rib. I was strangled 18 times, and I had 2 black eyes. Are you sure you want me to get over it? Because I'm going to tell you more. See, Officer Basham didn't have to die, and many of these officers wouldn't even have to. But a lot of times what ends up happening is I ran into problems where even at the women's shelters, they were running out of funds, or they couldn't even take me because there was discrepancy in my case. Now, I've had a history of domestic violence, even going back to when I was a little girl. So my name will come up quite frequently if you've actually asked some of the advocates in this region and even in the state. I went to Cranberry Township, my neighborhood. People would not have recognized me. I had extremes, obviously. I wasn't getting medical attention. In fact, by the time I got to see the judge, they awarded me relocation funds. By the time I left the area to get serious major surgery, because I was diagnosed with a tumor while I was in the women's shelter in Washington County, I went through the major surgery, and I also was diagnosed with other health issues. It could have crippled me, but it didn't, not quite. Well, I went into surgery, and my abuser came back, and the day I came out of surgery, he ripped open my surgical wound. For me to get compensation, I would have to have gone interstate through the state of Missouri, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. It's too complicated. Ask even the representatives at the victims' compensation. It's just entirely impossible to keep up with these cases. If, according to the way things are going, I could have had like 10 different compensation cases. That's how many incidents of domestic violence abuse. It's literally a shock. I mean, it's literally a miracle I'm even here to talk. I didn't even really have the basic verbal skills. I had to learn how to talk to a lot of people. It was really, really awkward to talk to total strangers because I was so afraid for my life. I was living in safe houses, on and on. I went without gas. I still go without a lot of things. Most of you guys would not eat the food that some of us had to eat, okay? I hear a lot of people complain about things, and I wish I could trade places with some of you, but one of the most terrifying things I was told is to move on and get over it. There's not enough money to keep up with the surgeries. I can't afford to keep up with the crises in PTSD and therapy, EMDR, grounding Gershall therapies that we need. There's not enough money. It's a very expensive, if you don't know by now, to go see some of the best therapists in the city of Pittsburgh. But if you would look at me, people said, well, you don't look like the kind of person that I don't wear the label, I'm a victim. In fact, I hid from that label. It was very embarrassing, but I had to learn to talk about this because I realized if I don't get in front of this, this is going to happen to somebody else. And I have to tell you, when you hear of a victim that's in crisis and you don't have a friend in the world, it really feels good when you hear another victim and survivor representing people out there like that. And Representative Corbin was in front of it, and I personally had a chance to thank her. To me, that's a huge privilege, because if you would ask me almost 10 years ago, I wouldn't even have the courage to make that phone call, much less embarrass myself and go on and talk about my case. What I'm saying is I've spent many, many times talking to Representative Christiana's office. I personally got to know Paula, and I spent a lot of time talking to them about this new legislation for victims and children. And one of the things is victims don't necessarily have to be women now. Actually, it was one of my biggest projects that I've been working on with other women's shelters throughout the United States about a bunker program, because most of our boys and men now are being abused in their homes as well. So obviously, domestic issue is not a co-ed issue. It could go either way now, and unfortunately, it's one of those things that are underreported. And when we talk about domestic violence, we talk about sexual abuse, we understand the cycle of abuse. We understand that. That's why therapy is so huge. Most of the crimes and abuse victims don't have to continue that cycle. And why do they have to get into anger management classes? Because they may have been victims themselves. And if we have a chance to put the stop to the cycle of abuse, we can actually educate those people that could possibly end up in the situation they desperately hate. You can talk to a lot of the abuse offenders, especially regarding domestic violence, and they were probably the worst victims of all. It's a tragedy. So this is not like a win-win for me. Actually, me talking about this, it's complex for me, because when you talk about reporting a crime, the hardest one is to report a crime when it's involving somebody that has been an abuse victim themselves. It's very complicated. That's why we're looking at the issues that go farther beyond just domestic violence, but we're talking about history of child abuse. That's why this legislation is huge, because these people are living a life sentence because they were child abuse victims. And it goes back to the 60s, the 70s. There should be no statute of limitations for victims to get help. I bet you any money, the person that was involved in the matter that involved me, if they had gotten that kind of help, what kind of life would they have had? It will make a huge difference for the victims that have suffered the worst. It's very complicated when you talk about crimes, and because most of the times these crimes can be prevented. And the awareness is on both sides of issues, because most of the offenders that you might be encountering have suffered severe trauma. They're actually responding the way they were raised. I would say there's a crime victim in Pennsylvania who no longer lives in the state of Pennsylvania. He was repeatedly abused by his father. His neck was crushed. He's continually abused and attacked, made fun of. They used to throw spaghetti on his head. They harassed him. I mean, the harassment wasn't just at home, but it was at school. Could you imagine going home and then having to leave home after an episode of abuse only to get abuse at school? See, this is actually pretty common. I know some of you might be even sinking in your chair. You might know of a person, somebody that's suffering. That's why it's so important to talk about it. You don't have to sit there and go along with it, is what I'm saying. You have to be able to have enough bravery, enough within yourself to say, this should not happen. You shouldn't have to go along with abusing somebody. I know some of you go home to families and you watch maybe somebody in your family that gets unfairly taken advantage of. Even the rules that they put in force on that one person in your family is so unfair. Those rules wouldn't apply to anybody else, but there's something about that one person. Don't ignore this. Please, please, look out for each other. The best way to look out for another is don't go along with the bullying that goes on in your home, whether it goes on your street or in your school. It's too big. Some of you are sinking in your chair. You know you've been a part of it. You don't have to. You know, one of the most bravest things people can do, instead of being too concerned about ratting somebody out, one of the most smartest, wisest things I could ever see is somebody say, you know what? I've been sitting here watching them do this, and I'm not going to sit around and wait for somebody to say something. No, you don't have to be, quote, a whistleblower to look out for somebody. You're looking out for your friend. You're looking out for somebody. You don't even have to like them. Some of the greatest heroes in these stories are not always the people that are outspoken. It's just knowing that the victim had a chance to recover and move on. You might not ever see that victim again. But what you're doing is changing somebody's life. You don't have to do it, but you don't have to go along with abusing somebody. And there are people that live in homes like this, and that's why this is so critical, because there are secondary victims. There are people that watch this. They witness it every day. So when I look at these cases, I realize this is too big. We cannot pretend this doesn't exist. It's actually happened more often. It's probably more common than anything else. Look at your drug problem. Look where all these crimes stem from. If they can't deal with the crimes here, then how in the world are really law enforcement legitimately going to be able to enforce these laws, much less the legitimacy of these cases? Because I'm going to tell you, most of these law enforcements know when they look in the database, they have like a rating. They know that some of these people have been repeat offenders, and the victim's a repeat victim. There's something wrong there. It's not that the victim keeps calling because she just likes to call or he likes to call all the time. It's because they are repeat victims. And a lot of your hotlines and domestic violence hotlines, you have to ask yourself, that person keeps calling because they keep being victimized. They're not just calling because they want to talk on the phone for 2 hours. You're actually spending more of your time, and I know some of you who are volunteers on crisis hotlines, you hear it all, I'm sure of it. But if you have somebody calls and talks to you 2 hours, you know that sometimes it may take 2 hours to calm that person down. And you've all been generous with your time, and thank God for some of you. But I know that you know, and many of the law enforcement officers that deal with victims on one-on-one, it's never really the same. They remember your name. You know, what a thing to be remembered for. Being remembered for, because I had 2 black eyes and they were swollen shut. That's something to be remembered for. So if I'm going to be remembered for something, I want to be remembered for this. I want to see you guys make a difference for a victim out there. And you can make a difference by saying, hey, I want to know if our judge is going to get behind H.R. 951. A District Attorney Catherine Kane is. Representative Becky Corbin in Easton is getting in front of it. The representative in Washington County and Beaver County, Representative Christina, is getting in front of it. It doesn't have to be just window legislation now. It can be a reality. We got to knock out this wall. It's like invisible. For some reason, these victims can't get compensation. There's something wrong there. And it's only because something in that law is allowing it to stay there. And compensation means that this will give the families an opportunity for closure. Let me say this. And particularly for those of you who know about cases that some of us have worked on as advocates or volunteers. I consider myself a volunteer advocate right now. I don't know how I fit into all this, but that's kind of where I landed my feet. I've worked in women's shelters, or been around women's shelters in Missouri. And our women's shelters don't get the right kind of help. In fact, if you were to look at some of the shelters in the Midwest, you would be embarrassed at what's going on in Pennsylvania. I mean, they literally give these women 3 months to get on their feet, which to me is a lot of time. But in all honesty, if you want to really put a stop to the domestic violence problem, you give these women an opportunity. And in some cases now, the bunker program for men, 3 months to get on their feet and recover from their injuries. You have just changed radically their lives, and everything from churches networking to paying literally car repairs. And networking, it doesn't just mean that they're just coming for a handout. You're really changing lives, and this will I've seen the faces of law enforcement. I would say this, there's so many generous, kind people. They're just waiting for an opportunity to engage. And let me tell you, this model, this program can be duplicated here in Pennsylvania. We do not have to be behind the times anymore. I've done my research and homework, and I'm fortunate to be able to tell you that there is a lot of opportunity in Pennsylvania to change the way we handle domestic violence and how police officers can deal with victims in crime. And I have to tell you, these kind of advantages wouldn't be possible if we couldn't duplicate the programs. And some of these programs and the representatives from Missouri would be more than willing to help some of the domestic violence shelters here duplicate that program. In Springfield, Missouri, and in Branson, Missouri are two very important programs that I've worked personally with. I would be thrilled to see our Pennsylvania representatives work with Missouri and duplicate some of the domestic violence programs also in Texas as well. See, one of the things in Ohio and Pennsylvania, because this region's used to seeing a drug epidemic, they're also looking at the child abuse epidemic that goes with it. So they all tie together. But one of these programs and these outreach programs help the churches network together, something I've discussed this with other churches in this region. Do you know Dutill Church, Cranberry Township? One church that gets behind the victims, you never know it because they're not going to tell you. But they have helped so many families get back on their feet. So I could tell you these churches are there. They want to help. They just don't know how to. And if you get more churches to get involved with just even, gas card. And this, of course, have to be distributed through the women's shelters. And that's something that's communicated in this network. But this liaison, this program that we're trying to put together is a network for peer support and recovery and in the wraparound program. Because obviously after the victims graduate from the program and they're rehabilitated, the wraparound program's there to continue that support for the length of time they need it. What we're saying is we can radically change the way we deal with crime victims and how we deal with even with the perpetrators, empowering our police departments to have access to special funds as well as detectives. You know that these crimes can be prevented. I know you know this. See, it's not so much balancing a budget, it's where we're putting our money. If we get the power back to the police departments where they can enforce it and do more awareness projects, I guarantee if you see some of those kids that go into those, the assemblies, it's an hour off of school and it's well worth it because you're teaching kids how to be proactive. And I would say I could see this being such a big issue because of what happened in State College with the kids that were victims. Instead of looking at the victims as a problem, you get the kids behind these, and you see these kids cheering on the victims. A lot of these people that you might not be aware of it, but a lot of these kids are handicapped and crippled by child sexual abuse. Physical handicaps. So I'm telling you, when you get a wheelchair race going with a kid that was handicapped, you might not know it, but they might have been a trauma victim due to sexual abuse or physical abuse. It's so big that really, if I got into it, I might cry. So I'm really going to have to be careful how far I go with this. It's so important that you start opening up and talking to people because you'd be surprised how many victims are out there. I'm going to tell you, there was a little boy who was 4 years old. Now, before he was, or I think at the time, I wasn't aware of it, but he was a victim of sexual abuse. And I know we jumped in just in time. I didn't know it at the time. I was 14. And his case went to court. And it was because of me running, literally. But talking to my uncle, my grandfather was the attorney for the Pittsburgh police. But at the time, my Uncle Izzy, my grandfather had passed away. My Uncle Izzy was his brother. And we contacted the police, and the police jumped to action. Back then, there were the block parent programs. There were programs where people were involved in advocating for kids and families. It's changed so much. We got to get back to our schools. We got to get back to doing what works in Pennsylvania. And one of the things is Pennsylvania was one of the best states for this. We are friendlier communities, when people are close-knit, they're more likely to want to talk to their neighbors. But there's been a disconnect about how we feel about this issue. We're not here to demonize anybody. I know a lot of people think that, and that's really not really what's going on. It's not to look for the next person and poo-poo everything that goes on in our community. What it is bringing awareness into the school districts and going into those assemblies. And I've heard about police officers doing it for SAD and MAD. Why not for domestic violence? I mean, after Officer Basham, I think it's going to change. In fact, I know it's changing, and how we look at crimes against families, and that's happening within, and sometimes in some cases, the secondary victims, which are the children. And honestly, I think nowadays, like we said earlier, crimes aren't just between men and women. Now it's the same-sex couples. Domestic violence crimes are increasing with same-sex couples. So this is obviously not just a gender issue anymore. It's an issue for a lot of people. I think a lot of things is because we don't really understand the issue of domestic violence and the crimes against children, and even understand the fact that some of this legislation is just waiting to be pushed forward because it's election year. Now this, on some of the articles I'm going to post in the description box below, but of course everything kind of has been on pause because it is election year. But we need our community to start engage and ask what's going on. If your representatives in this area support HR 951, this is one of the issues that right now, if it can go from window legislation to now legislation, that's where we're at. In the next session, this is going to be very important because we're going into the next session and we need to see this pass. So I'm asking all of you to call your representatives and talk and find out about the people that are running in the state and find out about how they support HR 951. This is about the child abuse victims. Please get behind us. Thank you.